Hello everybody, welcome to US History. Today we're going to be talking about the Korean War, which in many ways is kind of the United States' most forgotten war, but in other ways has had large consequences which we still deal with today, especially with the divide between North and South Korea, and why those countries are so different. This was also the first big test of President Truman's containment policy, which will continue on into the Vietnam War as well. So in a lot of ways, the Korean War ends up becoming the staging ground for what the Cold War will be like, where we won't have a general huge war between the United States and the Soviet Union, but we are going to have a lot of these smaller proxy types of wars instead. This all starts with the Chinese Civil War back in 1949. That's really the beginning of this entire story. The Korean War is only going to be 1 year later in 1950, but the end of the Chinese Civil War is really the beginning of the Korean War. This is where mainland China is taken over by the communist faction. There were two factions fighting in the Chinese Civil War. We had the nationalist Chinese led by Chiang Kai-shek, and we also had the communist faction led by Mao. So Mao ends up winning, and what happens is the nationalist Chinese flee to the island of Taiwan, and they continue to claim to be the true government of China. This really freaks the United States out, because this is the first large country in the world to really fall to the communists. So the United States is understandably very concerned about this, and we don't want this to happen to any other country. So when it comes to a lot of civil wars that will be fought in the future between usually some sort of communist and anti-communist faction, the United States will end up backing the anti-communist faction, even if being anti-communist doesn't always mean being pro-democracy. This is something we'll see again and again. So for now, the nationalist Chinese who are now on the island of Taiwan, we recognize them as being the actual government of China, while something like 98% of mainland China is actually ruled by the communists. This will become a problem over and over again for the next 20 years of US-Chinese relations. Dividing Korea. So Korea is divided into two. We have kind of the USSR/communist side, which is North Korea, to the north, of course, and then the American/democracy side to the south. And so we have South Korea and North Korea, which are divided here on the 38th parallel line of latitude. So before these two used to be united, they were split up into two factions after the end of World War II, because the Japanese had actually taken over this whole area of land here. And so kind of as they were split apart from the victors of the war, the North went to the communist side, and then the South went to the American/democratic side. So that's why these two countries are so different. And the North Koreans end up wanting to unite the country between the two of them. So that's what's really going to start the Korean War here. The North ends up attacking the South first, and they make incredible gains. They basically make it all the way to the southern tip of South Korea. And Truman is really scared about this. He wants to contain communist aggression. So he goes to the United Nations and gets them to brand North Korea as an aggressor. This means that he can now create a UN coalition force to push the North Koreans out of South Korea. Truman gains approval from the UN, and he sends troops to Korea without congressional approval. This is really the first time this is going to happen, and this is also going to become a trend of United States presidents being able to send troops into another country without getting the express written commission from Congress. Usually in the past, anytime there's been a war declared, we needed congressional approval. This is going to start a new trend where presidents, being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, can technically still send troops wherever they want to. So this is going to start that. However, he did get UN approval for this action, and many people in Congress were very much in favor of the war. So even if it did have to come to a vote, they probably would have approved it, but he didn't even need that. So this is the first time where the UN is going to come together, and the first big test of the United Nations as well. The United Nations technically has 16 countries who send troops to Korea, but the United States ends up being 80% of the force that will actually fight in the war. And once again, this will become a trend where sometimes there will be a unilateral, many nations being able to, try to boost democracy and fight against the communists, but it will end up being the United States who takes the huge majority of the burden of that. Douglas MacArthur is chosen as the Supreme Commander. He was well known for fighting in the Pacific Theater during World War II and had been in charge of the occupation of Japan, which had been going on for 5 years at this point, where America was technically in charge of rebuilding Japan and rebuilding their government as well to be more democratic. So Douglas MacArthur was in charge of all of that, and he's been given a new task to win the war in Korea. So he pushes the North Koreans back to the border with China. And then eventually Chinese reinforcements from over here push the coalition force back to the original border at the 38th parallel, this line here. So remember, the North Koreans come in, they get pushed back, we push them all the way up to China, and then they push back here to the border. So it's kind of like a seesaw, to where first it goes south, then the fighting goes up north, then it basically ends in a stalemate right where they started. So this will become the main place of the battle is going to be the 38th parallel, and mostly the main forces of the North and the communists with their allies in China being built up over here, and the South, the forces of the Americans and their allies being right here. So they're just kind of staring each other down right at the 38th parallel. So after a lot of early fighting, it ends at this kind of stalemate portion where there's not too much fighting. So this is where we have MacArthur fighting against Truman, because MacArthur technically works for Truman. He is the supreme commander of the forces there, but Truman is still the commander-in-chief, and they have a disagreement on how to fight the war. MacArthur wants to open up a second front with the nationalists in Taiwan attacking China. Remember, the ones who had lost the Civil War just a few years before. MacArthur wants them to go back to China and attack and open up a second front. Truman fears this will start a huge and costly world war with, escalating it to where maybe nuclear weapons have to be used, and he really doesn't want that to happen. MacArthur criticizes the president for being weak in a letter, and the letter's made public, and Truman feels like he has to fire MacArthur for insubordination. But MacArthur is still seen as a hero to many. Even still, and here's a famous quote he had. He said, "Defensive strategy has never produced ultimate victory." He was very much more gung-ho about fighting against the communists and using nuclear weapons if necessary. Truman was very against. He was much more cautious. He wanted to contain communism, but not fight back and cause a third world war, like MacArthur was almost willing to do. So the 1952 election happens in the middle of the Cold War, and this ends up kind of leading to the end of it. Remember, the Korean War starts in 1950. There is an election in 1952, and this will be the end of Truman's term. The person who gets elected is the famous General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had fought over in the Western front of World War II. He threatens the use of atomic weapons once he gets into office, and also Stalin died in 1953. There's more moderate Soviet leaders who end up becoming the leaders of the Soviet Union, and once there's there are more moderate people in charge of the country, they're much more willing to negotiate and end the war. So the North and South of Korea end up agreeing to a ceasefire in 1953 and leave the border back to where it was before the war even began. And technically they're still at war. A ceasefire, remember, is not the same thing as a surrender. So while both countries have basically agreed to a ceasefire, the war has still technically never ended. What were the effects of the Korean War? Well, there were 54,000 Americans killed and 103,000 wounded. Americans questioned if their government was really serious about stopping communism, because we kind of paid this large price in terms of how many people died and how many people were wounded, but we didn't end up actually getting that full victory that we wanted. So sometimes the Americans back home were thinking, are we actually serious about, stopping communism? Because we didn't use all the tools at our disposal, such as nuclear weapons. North and South Korea would develop as different countries after this, so we still have this today, to where we have the North ruled in a communist way, a dictatorship, and the South Korea is still run by a legislature and has free market capitalism. Relations with China would sour for over 20 years, but nuclear war was avoided. This is also the first war where we have integrated units, black and white Americans fighting next to each other. That didn't exist in World War II. The Korean War is the first time we have what's known as integrated units. And here's one of the biggest effects of the Korean War, which was an increase in military spending and what's known as the military-industrial complex. We can see here that after World War II, we have a sharp decrease in war spending, but it comes back up for the Korean War and never really goes back down again. So this is where we start having an international permanent mobilization, where we start having, we have a constant building of our war capabilities. We make it so we don't shut down, the plants where they're manufacturing tanks and they're manufacturing weapons like guns. And, we're not going to stop building ships. We're going to continue that going basically indefinitely, as you can see here. This is what's known as the military-industrial complex. This is basically where there's links to corporations gaining a lot of money and continuing to have a lot of money if there is a continual buildup in arms for the U.S. Army. And this is really kind of the lasting effect of the Korean War, is that after, we're going to contain the Soviet Union and we're going to contain the communist threat at any cost, and that means we're going to pay for it. So there's a continued emphasis on spending in the federal government and spending for a war that could happen, as opposed to, only spending money when wars do happen. It ends up becoming half of the federal budget is just on military spending. And that's something that's going to hold for many, many years during the Cold War. And this is really one of the biggest lasting effects. Of course, we still have North and South Korea, which are very different countries still to this day. And the idea of them ever unifying, the farther we get from the Korean War, the more unlikely it seems, but we never know what really the future holds. So we'll see what ends up happening to Korea in the future. What's also interesting about the Korean War is that it kind of is a staging ground for how the Vietnam War will end up happening as well. Because in that war as well, we're going to have a communist northern side and a allied with the United States southern side. So, and they're also split at a line of longitude. So, line of latitude, I'm sorry. Line of latitude. Those are the ones that go horizontal. So that's some of the important effects of the Korean War. And if you are like my dad, of course, it also leads to the TV show MASH, which is a classic. So thank you guys for joining us today. Next time we are going to be talking about civil rights and the civil rights movement in the United States. So that should be a very interesting unit. And then finally, we're going to be probably finishing things up this year with the Vietnam War. So hopefully you will join me then. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.